Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Functional Forum. Super excited to have you here on the show tonight. Thank you, Dr. Megan Walker. That is my favorite intro ever, so I thought I'd use it on tonight's forum. And so I'm glad to be here with all of you this evening. Tonight is the third part of our Reinvention of Mental Health. And so I am super excited for today's topic and very, very happy to be sharing on this specific topic tonight. Over the last couple of months, we did a baseline episode looking at the sort of mechanisms of the future of mental health. And then last month, we did a focus on depression. So just to take you through what we're going to be doing, if you want to engage with us tonight, I've got my special guest who I'm about to introduce to you. We're going to be taking questions. If you're on live, you can use hashtag Functional Forum on Twitter. I want to get everyone used to this again, because in 2 months' time, on the 1st of November, we're going to be going back to the old school live Functional Forum, live from Boulder, Colorado. We're going to have an epic show on the 1st of November. So I want to get everyone back into the habit of using the hashtag, because that's how we'll be taking questions. So just before we get into it, thank you so much for our resource partners here at the Evolution of Medicine. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things tonight. We're going to be talking about the Evolution of Medicine's Practice Accelerator. Twice a year do we do an intake into that in February and September. It is September, so we'll chat a little bit about it. But here at the Evolution of Medicine, we have curated resources from across the industry that have proven to be most effective at helping people build sustainable, successful practices. So let's start with the state of addiction medicine. And with me, I have Dr. Aimie de la Garza. She is a family medicine physician who is now focusing all of her time in bringing functional medicine to the addiction space. And we've had a number of really interesting conversations. So, Doctor, welcome to the Functional Forum, your debut on the Functional Forum. I'm sure it won't be the last time. What is the state of addiction medicine in 2021, and how has it changed from the pandemic?
Well, Nora Volkow, who's the director of the National Institute for Drug Abuse, just published a great article in Scientific America, August 31st, actually, talking about the tragic state of addiction in our country. 93,000 people died of drug-related fatalities last year, up 30% from the previous year. And that is just so tragic for our patients, our families, our community. And certainly the pandemic has played a role in that. I don't think that any of us would deny that. But, we've been in a substance abuse epidemic for years now. And I think that the pandemic has just really highlighted that and made a lot of us start talking about what else can we do. I mean, our primary focus as addiction medicine physicians is to get people into evidence-based treatments and onto evidence-based medications, right? That's our primary goal as addiction medicine physicians, psychiatrists, and medical, family practice doctors, internists. But what can we do beyond that? And that's really where I've really started to focus my attention over the last couple of years as I've become certified in functional medicine. And as I've been working as an addiction medicine fellow here in Utah, really trying to figure out what else can we do? Because what we're doing is not working.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what was the sort of the genesis of your decision to go and study functional medicine, and what out of that toolkit did you think had potential, and were you even like on the path towards addiction at that point?
Yes, I've been practicing addiction since I was a resident starting in 2010. So I've been doing this for a while now. I didn't really become interested in functional medicine until about 3 years ago when I was just randomly handed your book by a colleague. And I read that, and I really started to think then, like, okay, what's going on with addiction? I mean, there's so much of addiction that's intergenerational, right? So intergenerational substance use, intergenerational trauma, intergenerational poverty and lack of education and ability to access resources. But from the functional medicine standpoint, I really started thinking about, how are my patients eating? And how are they sleeping? And how are they moving? You know, sort of the central components of functional medicine. And as it turns out, I mean, nobody with substance use disorder, very few people with substance use disorder, very few people with behavioral health diagnoses, if you really dig into it, are taking care of themselves in any meaningful way when it comes to their physical health, which we all know directly affects our brain. If your gut's not happy, if your body's not happy, if you're inflamed, your brain's inflamed too. And that is certainly not helping our most vulnerable humans that we take care of.
Yeah, I mean, most vulnerable is one thing, but like I used to live in Los Angeles, and I know there's some very high priced addiction centers there where you're paying like tens of thousands of dollars every month for care. If functional medicine is not happening there, like what is happening there? Like what is the standard of care that is being delivered, even at high price institutions, that's not meeting the mark?
Well, I think that's a really critical question to ask. And Dr. Volkow actually addresses that in her Scientific America article. You know, we need to get people into evidence-based care. So at the risk of upsetting a lot of people, you know, all of these fancy, high-priced residential addiction treatment facilities across this country have been very reluctant to embrace evidence-based medical and behavioral treatments for addiction. And I'm talking about medications like Suboxone or buprenorphine and naltrexone or Vivitrol, Antabuse, and Camprosate. There's just this idea, this stigma around not using medications for people with addiction because somehow they're going to become addicted to other substances or other medications. So I think the primary thing as addiction medicine docs and addiction psychiatrists and legislators and communities, we need to really hold treatment centers accountable to evidence-based care. And then we need to start looking at what are the other sort of complementary approaches that have some evidence that aren't going to endanger people, that can complement those evidence-based treatments for addiction. And we're really at a crucial junction with that, I think.
Yeah. So when you show up now where you work and you start talking about functional medicine concepts, either the bottom of the matrix that you just shared there, or talking about how people degenerate or their physiology degenerates over time to like drive these addictions, what kind of like looks, response, feedback do you get from other people who just live and breathe addiction medicine that haven't had that education?
You know, it's been really remarkable. Everyone that I have talked with about this has been so receptive. And I have an incredible group of colleagues here in Utah. My good friend and colleague, Paula Cook, who's also an addiction medicine doc, and I worked together at a large nonprofit federally funded program here as part of my fellowship. And we actually ran group medical visits, 12-week curriculum for people in residential treatment, where we focused on nutrition, sleep, movement, meditation. And I mean, like really digging into these concepts with these people, right? And it was met with such openness and such a willingness to sort of dig into this and really what is driving a lot of the behavioral issues that we see in people with substance use disorder. And I don't mean behavior of using substances. I mean depression, anxiety, insulin resistance, gut dysfunction, you know, all of those things that really drive physical and mental health. There isn't a person who's really looked at me sideways, which is so amazing, right? I think we're all feeling the pain of watching what we're doing not work. And so people's minds are becoming more and more open to what can we do? How can we engage these people? How can we create a community for these individuals to learn not just how to stay off drugs? Like that is not the point. Getting people to be abstinent should not be our primary focus. Our focus should be, how can we bring people together into communities where they can be less isolated, experience less loneliness, pain, depression, anxiety, and learn, like really learn with integrity how to take care of themselves. Because if we can't get people together and make them feel empowered, it's going to be really hard to convince them to stop using substances.
Absolutely. Yeah, so many good points there. And I'm reminded of the Johann Hari quote, who says the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but human connection. And it sounds like what you're saying there is like right on line with that, right?
Oh, I mean, exactly. I mean, it's just people are so isolated and so sad. And when you look at Jeffrey Geller's work and when you read your book about, community medicine, and I mean, this just speaks to those of us who treat people with substance use disorder, because I mean, going back to the first AA meeting, I mean, that's all done in a group. That's all a group medical visit model, right? Like, totally. So group medical visits, functional medicine, community medicine, and addiction care just dovetail so beautifully together. I think we just need to expand the focus. We need to expand what we're focusing on in those groups and really teach people how to take care of themselves and not just always be talking about, are you abstinent or not? Because substance use is a chronic, remitting, relapsing disease, right? There's going to be people using or not using, or using a little or using a lot at every group that you have. And so really meeting people where they are and trying to empower them to take care of themselves should really be our focus. And that's why I love the intersection of functional medicine and addiction, is because that's really our goal, right? Is to educate and to create community. And so that's really my focus as I went through the last half of my fellowship and as I sort of move into the next phase of my career in addiction medicine.
Beautiful. Well, look, I want to come back with some specific questions, but you did mention Dr. Jeff Geller there, and I want to give a special shout out to Dr. Geller, who is putting on the first conference on group medical visit this Friday. It's available for 5 CMEs. If you just Google Group Visit Medical Conference, Dr. Geller, you can find it, or we'll have links in the show notes. We've had the emails in links in our email. I'm super excited, because Jeff has just been such a leader in the space, and having witnessed him actually run groups, I realized that there's just this incredible skill and facilitation that he's developed, and that, we need a lot more of that in healthcare. So that's this Friday, the 17th. And, on that topic, I want to bring on our first interview guest. So Amy's going to be staying with us here, but I want to share our first interview is going to be with Dr. Paul Thomas. He wrote a book called The Addiction Spectrum. Dr. Thomas has actually been featured on our platform before, but more for his work with pediatrics. He had exceptional outcomes in his pediatric clinic with regard to chronic inflammatory, autoimmune, and chronic illnesses in his pediatric practice. But he's also board certified in addiction and wrote a book called The Addiction Spectrum. And so I want to share this interview that we did last week about his thoughts on what is the addiction spectrum and why it's important for people in functional medicine to understand. Here we go. So a warm welcome back to the show, Dr. Paul Thomas. Welcome, Doc.
Hey, James. It's great to be back with you.
Great to be chatting with you a little bit about the addiction world. And I know you wrote a book called The Addiction Spectrum. So let's just start there. Why is addiction a spectrum, and why did you have to call your book that?
So, my own story, missionary kid, grew up in the church, never saw alcohol, never saw drugs till I was pretty much out of high school. And I loved the effect of alcohol. I took it too far eventually, right? And so I was a college party kind of drinker, but I always drank very heavily. I loved it. It finally moved to a severity where I was drinking every day, and drinking to the point where, at times it was blackout drinking. There is an example of a spectrum of severity, right? You have a person who, I can tell you, I am predisposed to be an alcoholic. I didn't know that, or predisposed to having addictions, let's say. But I didn't know that. And had I never touched alcohol, obviously I would never have had problems. But I did. And then I moved it along this spectrum of severity to where I could no longer stop, right? It became, for 13 years, my number one goal, and I'm a very successful, goal-oriented type person. For 13 years, my number one goal was to stop drinking, and I couldn't do it on my own, right? So I had moved the severity of my disease, my alcoholism, to such a point that it was no longer in my own control. And this is a point that I wanted to get across to readers and to your listeners, is that spectrum of severity in your addiction, if you want to call it that. And actually, as an addiction specialist and addictionologist, board certified in that discipline, we don't like to use the word addiction because it has such a negative connotation. So we'll say alcohol use disorder, or, opioid use disorder, rather than, oh, it's an addiction. That just has a negative connotation. But hey, I'm old school. I was just calling it what I was calling it, calling myself an alcoholic, calling addiction when I wrote the book. But the key point is this: whatever you're struggling with, it could be cigarettes, it could be any drug, you name it. It could be alcohol, it could be gambling, it could be sex, it could be food, overeating. Whatever your struggle is, there is this severity thing. It may be just a minor pleasure at first, or using it for relief, but then eventually you might take it so far that you can't seem to stop. And my hope is that by understanding that it is a spectrum, becoming aware of it, once you identify it, you can probably do something about it before it gets to that point of no return.
So for the clinicians who are watching, who are interacting with patients for the first time, or then actually building a relationship with patients over time, what are some signs and symptoms that you look for people moving along the spectrum, and how do people start to move along the severity spectrum of their addiction?
Well, it's sort of individual and extremely subtle, right? I think it's important for people to understand that the addiction is actually not the problem. It's the symptom. The problem is something in our lives is off. Something is causing us distress. Something is causing us fear, isolation, loneliness, a sense of I need relief. For some people, it could be actual pain, physical or emotional. And whatever it is that underlying lack or need, the substance or behavior that becomes your relief then eventually becomes your problem, right? So some of the things you would see if you're starting to wonder if you've got a problem with a substance or a behavior, is it's starting to interfere with your life. You're starting to choose that activity over other things that used to be important to you. You're starting to let go of things that used to be important. You're starting to isolate. People who are in trouble with their addiction or their substance use or their behavior don't want others to know. So they start isolating socially, avoiding group interactions and the activities that used to bring them great joy and pleasure.
Become a ton more isolated, but also like the whole infrastructure for the sort of group support network for isolation has essentially been destroyed, right? Where the local groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, never mind the sort of fledgling functional medicine group infrastructure that was forming has been destroyed. What has been the effect of that on the practice of addiction medicine? And, what do clinicians need to know about treating people who have been through this intense period of isolation?
Yeah. Well, treatment saves lives. We've known that from a long time ago. There's bumper stickers to that effect for over a decade. That's still true. And I think it's a myth that you have to want it in order to be helped. It is very useful if you want it, because, you know, if you're engaged, the success rate goes way up, right? But if you're a clinician and you've got someone who needs help, do everything in your power to connect them to resources and to provide them that lifeline, because you might be that one person that gives them some hope. Isolation is the absolute worst thing for people who are in an addiction, because addiction is isolating in and of itself. And so now you talk about the 12-step programs, for example, there are programs online, and that works very well for some people. In fact, I think for the younger folks who are very used to being on screens, that's actually been a huge plus to have meetings are available from all over the world. So there is definitely the availability of that, but humans need touch. And this is something that, you know, really struck me with everything I've gone through personally. If you're not getting physical touch, that can be very isolating. And you eventually, if you're already struggling anyway, I think that can be very difficult. So finding a way to still be in physical touch with people who love you and care about you, or just, you know, maybe it's not touch, you might be really someone who can't handle touch, but just being physically together is helpful.
You know, when I was reading your book, actually it was probably a couple of years ago now, I know that there was this great analogy that you had and an interesting diagram about the frogs on a log. And I'd love for you to share that, just because I feel like, you know, for so many clinicians that we work with in the functional medicine space, you know, there's this intention for their patients to get healthy, but, you know, that's really just the starting point. And, you know, the facilitation of, you know, integration is really where it's at. So do you want to share that? Because I just think that's a great analogy for patients.
Oh, sure. And this wasn't original to me. I heard this and it just resonated. So I put an image, I had an artist draw an image of 3 frogs sitting on a log. And the question is, there's 3 frogs sitting on a log and one decides to jump into the pond. How many frogs are left on the log? So you had 3, one decides to jump. How many are left? Well, the answer is 3. Deciding to act is not enough. You have to take the leap. And I think this is so important to really comprehend. When you're in an addiction, when you're engaged in a behavior that you're using to help you deal with your pain, your fear, your isolation, whatever it may be, you kind of, oftentimes you've got to at least be aware that it's an issue for you, right? Identifying the problem, that is the first step. And deciding to do something about it is the next step. But until you take action, nothing has happened, right? And so you've got to move from that point of making a decision to actually taking the leap. And that leap might be seeking a counselor, but actually showing up for that counseling session. It might be actually talking to a loved one who you know will hear you or at least listen, so that you now are not just all on your own, isolated with your own thoughts and spinning around and not really reaching out and getting that process started of getting help.
Beautiful. Well, I guess one last thing I just want to ask you. So last month we had a focus on depression specifically, and there was a lot of conversation, you know, in that one particularly about some of the new therapies that are arriving in the depression space around psychedelic treatment. And I was just wondering how you feel the potential of those kind of treatments are for an addicted population. What is the potential and what are the risks?
That's a controversial topic. So coming from the addiction space, I know there are people who have been helped with that modality, the use of psychedelics to somehow break the cycle for them. I would caution that if you engage in that journey, you do it under direct supervision with someone who has experience using that modality, and you make a commitment to yourself that you will not seek relief from psychedelics on your own. It's a slippery slope. Mind-altering substances, period, for those of us who are uncomfortable in our own skin. If you're anxious or depressed, by the way, folks, that is a physical condition. It's not an emotional. You don't have, I mean, we in medicine, we lump it into mental health as if there's something wrong with your mental health or your brain. We know in functional medicine, it's physical. I mean, there are issues with your neurotransmitters. You can't just, you wake up in the morning and you go, I'm going to be great today. No, if your neurotransmitters are in the toilet, I mean, they're just almost non-existent. You wake up and you go, crap, it's another day like that. Or you don't even have the energy to think that. I mean, you are just so flat wiped out. So I think there are places for resets, and people who know what they're doing with psychedelics are able to do that. I just know that the majority of the people I work with, if you give them an opportunity to use a mind-altering substance, it may just become another addiction.
Thank you for sharing that. And Doc, I really appreciate your, I just want to acknowledge your commitment to human health at all levels. Your work with addiction and your book was amazing. And also your pediatric clinic. I'm in awe of the work that you've done to facilitate human health. And it's been a pleasure to have you back on the Evolution of Medicine format.
Hey, thanks for having me, James. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. All right, Aimie. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that. What did you resonate with that? It sounds like there's a lot of, commonality in some of what you're talking about, but possibly some divergence as well.
Yeah, no, I really think that conversation was spot on. I mean, I love how he talked about, addiction being so isolating. I think that falls right in line with the conversation that we've been having. I really, really appreciated how he talked about, needing to recognize that there's a root cause to addiction. I think of substance use disorder as a symptom of something that's much deeper. I mean, we know that substance use disorder is a chronic disease, of course, but there's always a reason why people start using, or their use becomes, falls further and further along this spectrum that he spoke about. So really trying to get to the root cause of what's going on, that really spoke to me. And then really, I mean, the last sort of discussion that you had about psychedelic medicine and the addiction space, I think everything that he said was so important. There just isn't a lot of great data yet for psychedelics in the treatment of people with substance use disorder, with the exception of maybe some very early data on alcohol use disorder and ketamine. But that data is not concrete yet. I mean, we're not prescribing ketamine for our patients with alcohol use disorder by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. But so I think I agree with everything that he said. And for me, this includes the idea of, medical cannabis. And this also will probably make a lot of people upset as well. But, cannabis is not a treatment for substance use disorder. It is certainly not a treatment for opioid use disorder, despite a lot of discussion that, legalizing marijuana has reduced opioid overdoses. I mean, I just told you we've had more overdoses than we've ever had. Cannabis being, legalized is not helping that situation. But I really agreed with what he said, that the psychedelic space is very new, and we have to be very careful about talking to our patients with substance use disorder about the use of any mind-altering substances, because it's a very slippery slope.
I want to ask you specifically about sort of juvenile use, I guess. So so let's say ages 15 to 25, if the reinvention of mental health around addiction is the infiltration of functional medicine principles and getting people to take care of themselves, I just would love to get your thoughts on how you facilitate that for young people. Because I know, it's pretty normal in society that people take bigger risks. Like, you know, I have 2 kids now and I like have my place in the world and I'm excited about my work. There's no way I would do some of the stuff that I did when I was 18 and 19 again, because like, I know the risks, I know the fallout if it went drastically wrong. And so when you're dealing with, you know, people in that age group, how do you help them to, you know, to start to realize that, you know, that they're going to have to take better care of themselves in order to get better, when, you know, taking care of yourself is not really something that most people are pushed into until something starts going wrong. And then they're just like, well, I better like not eat this, or I better start exercising otherwise. Because when you're young, it's just like easy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question, James. I spend a lot of my time talking to people between the ages of 15 and I would say 18,
Okay.
who are coming to me. Their parents are bringing them to me, or they're coming to me because they're experiencing such significant anxiety and isolation, especially over the last year, insomnia, depression. And it is so interesting when you start talking to this age group about what they're eating and how they're sleeping and how they're moving. I don't know what it is. I'm not aware of any data about this at this point, but I am telling you, as soon as kids have access to transportation that does not involve their parent, how they procure food and how they eat and how they sleep becomes so dysfunctional that no wonder they're anxious. I mean, if you're not sleeping because you're on your phone all night, and then you're drinking these huge, whatever these sugar-filled caffeine things are that these kids are all drinking 3 times a day, or energy drinks, or the Mountain Dew that you can get from my kids' high school from the vending machine, you are going to be anxious. You are not going to be able to sleep. Your gut is going to be inflamed. You're going to gain weight, especially if you're a girl. And your risk of developing a problem with substances, I feel like, probably skyrockets, because those kids have access, they want to be socially accepted, and they feel like garbage. And the one thing that will make them feel better is cannabis, Juuls, nicotine, and alcohol. And, you know, a lot of
And
people
sugar for a very small window until it doesn't again, right?
Right. And the thing that we know now is that young brains are so vulnerable to substances. And, you know, the ABCD study, the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, that's nationwide right now. This study is going to give us so much critical information about how our children's brains respond to food, to sleep, to trauma, and to substances. And so while we talk to adolescents, I think we need to sort of move away from this idea of don't do drugs, drugs are bad, to you may experiment with substances, but let's talk about harm reduction. Let's have a real conversation about how substances affect your brain, even marijuana, because, you know, newsflash, folks, marijuana is not good for anyone's brain, but the brain it's really not good for is a little person. It can be devastating. Nicotine and Juuls are devastating for young brains, and so is alcohol. And so we move from like, oh, it's okay, kids are going to experiment, that's fine. I'm going to, you know, let my kids experiment and sort of turn the other way, to no, you guys, experimenting can really hurt your brain. So here's all of the information. Please ask me questions. Please have conversations with me if you're thinking about experimenting with substances, because we know now that the stakes are so high. And when you throw in poor nutrition, poor sleep, depression, anxiety, and isolation, we just have a melting pot for a generation of kids that could be in real trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, one of the reasons why I kind of moved here to where I live and have the school choices that I have is that, you know, one of the things that I just realized is that social pressure is like the biggest thing. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, like, if all the other kids do all the things you just said. And also, I see it with like TV and with like cereal and all these other things.
Oh,
where,
yes. Food is huge.
Yeah. The branded thing is like the cool thing to have, and then it's like, what have you got? Like that just seems like a super recipe for disaster. So in our little like Waldorf community, there's like a very, I just know the other parents, and I've been to their house and I see what they feed their kids, and it makes me feel like really good. And I've met their older kids and I'm like, man, I want my kids to be like you. So,
hey, where do you live? Is there any house for sale where you live? Can I come there?
It was a very specific choice. I mean, I left Los Angeles for basically this reason, because I was like, I could already tell that the mental health implications of being a girl in Los Angeles, never mind all of that other stuff, was like a recipe for disaster. And so, it was a pretty hard thing to decide, because I love living there, but like, I'm a dad. I have an 8-year-old daughter now. She was 5 or 6 then. I have a new daughter, and it was just like, had to like pull the ripcord.
You're the smartest person ever. Yeah. I mean, I'm telling you, I talk to my husband and my friends all the time. I'm like, in addition to talking to my kids about what it means to experiment with substances, I am even more forceful in talking to my kids about what they're putting in their mouth. I found out the other night that my kid was buying Mountain Dews. So I have a set of twins. They're 15 years old. And my one twin told on the other twin that he's been buying Mountain Dews from the vending machine. That's how I found out that the vending machines are in the school. And I swear I almost had a heart attack. You would have thought I would have found out my kid was like, smoking cigarettes in the car on the way to swim practice. Like, I was devastated. I was like, come on, like putting that in your brain first thing in the morning is like, it's terrible for you. And these kids that I see in my clinic, they're doing it all day long, and they're doing it with no sleep, and they're doing it with this background of just social distress, I guess is what I would call it, for lack of a better word.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad we were able to touch on that, because that seems like mission critical, around the country right now. And we're going to talk a little bit more about groups. I want to bring in our other speaker today. So if you've been following our content, last week, we had Dr. Aimie Apigian on the podcast, and she's an addiction specialist, but very uniquely, she decided that she didn't like seeing patients one-on-one, and she didn't like being in practice. So she does all of her care through virtual groups. And I wanted to share this because ultimately, this topic is the reinvention of medicine. And yes, the medicine that we have to do is going to be different, but the way that we deliver the medicine has to be different to match what we're talking about. You've heard Dr. Thomas and Dr. De La Garza talk about community connection. This is why I wrote this book. This is why, we're doing it like this, because ultimately, these are diseases of disconnection, and we need to get connected into that. So I'm going to bring up Aimie. We're going to have a few minutes, sort of like the highlights from the podcast the other day, and particularly some things regarding her journey in 5 years from being a resident to now having like a fully online, fully group, practice. Because I think that for many practitioners, many doctors, I think, just see very limited options coming out of medical school, clinically and practically. And I guess what I wanted to do is just to revitalize everyone's mind about the opportunities. So let's check this out. For practitioners who are seeing people who are addicted, and maybe you could just share, like, what are some of the lessons that you learned from functional medicine that you've applied to addiction medicine that you feel are critical to unwinding these kind of cases in an elegant way?
Absolutely. So when I look at the nervous system, I look at everything that will keep it stuck. And in my work with trauma, I look at people who are stuck in what I call either a sympathetic response and they're chronically stressed, or they've gone into what I call a chronic freeze, and especially like a functional chronic freeze, where they're constantly in overwhelm. And then many people go back and forth between overwhelm and stress all day long. And those are patterns in the nervous system that, get wired in, and they are really the root cause of so many diseases. Everything, right? Because the nervous system really drives the immune system. It drives the cardiovascular system. It drives the adrenals. So the nervous system I see as the root cause of so many physical conditions, chronic pain, especially chronic fatigue, as well as then the emotional, mental, and all of the addictions. Addictions are all about regulating the nervous system, and people just are finding coping mechanisms to self-medicate their nervous system. And so the nervous system is really the focus of all of my work. So when I look at the principles from functional medicine that I'm applying, it's everything is through that lens of how is it affecting the nervous system. So one of the places that I start with often is, I do a lot with the gut, but also one of the first places that I start is the mitochondria and the whole energy system. Because for people who are in this chronic freeze and overwhelm state, the body goes into overwhelm because it does not have enough energy to meet that stress. And so one of the first things that can be helpful for people is bringing in more energy to that system, just so that we can decrease the overwhelm and they can actually do some of this other work that's needed to be done. And so then we look at everything that's affecting the nervous system. What is everything that's draining the energy? And we look at inflammation. We look at the gut, we look at the digestive system, because that's a big source of energy drain on the whole system. So I do a lot with food sensitivities. I do a lot with actually looking at how is your absorption? How is your digestive system? Anytime that people have had what I call stored trauma in their body, and I think at this point, kind of everybody has had some degree of stored trauma just from life in their body, it affects the vagus nerve, and so it affects the digestive system. And so depending to the degree that it has affected that, that's where a lot of the energy drain comes from, either because of inflammation or because your body's just not even able to really absorb the nutrients that you're taking in. But then there's this whole category of toxins and imbalances. And so copper excess or zinc deficiency, micronutrients. And so there are so many things that fall into these categories of what is actually affecting the nervous system and really pushing the whole biology system closer to that line of overwhelm that we're just going to shut down, rather than being able to stay in parasympathetic, relaxed, connected, calm, at our best physical health, best mental and emotional health, and certainly out of that sympathetic and stress. But overwhelm is such a strong state that so many people are in these days, that addressing the overwhelm first is usually what I start with, and using the functional medicine principles to specifically look at what is causing overwhelm in the system is what I'm doing.
I know that when practitioners are trying to make a switch from their old world to their new world, a different clinical operating system and a new practice model, doing both of those simultaneously is a recipe for failure and burnout, honestly. And so it's really smart to be able to create a low overhead environment, learn as you go. We've seen so many practitioners in the accelerator renegotiate their conventional medicine contract so that they can keep some money coming in, and then go and learn clinically, but also start to learn operationally, because when you're empowering people to make behavior changes, it's a different system. You need to build systems that you don't need in conventional medicine when you're just having appointments and making prescriptions.
Mm-hmm. And especially having a niche like I had, it was hard to do some of the group visits for the functional medicine piece, because I didn't have enough people that were interested in addictions. And so again, just kind of taking everything that the accelerator program taught me, but having to make it my own and tailor it to the niche that I had chosen and my people. And you learn so much along the way. You learn so much from the actual process of implementing. And that was hard for me at first to make that jump from just, writing blogs, doing some videos, still kind of staying behind the curtain to actually, okay, I'm going to actually start opening doors and seeing people. There was some fear in that step, but that's where I learned so much and really was able to start making this my own and learning for my people, for my niche, what was needed, what was the most helpful. And so from there, it was a matter of building. As my audience built with my list, then now there was a need for a group program. And so that's the next piece that I brought in. And my first program was called Take Charge of My Trauma. And even with my addiction medicine things, like I start with the nervous system, I start with the trauma piece because that's fueling the addiction. And so once we calm down the nervous system, once we have the tools to regulate the nervous system, the biology is in a better place. Now we can look at actually, okay, let's take you off of the pain pills. Let's take you off of the benzodiazepines. Let's take you off of the alcohol. But we can't start with that without building the system up first. And so having that group program was the next best step for me. And again, you start into this and you're like, James, what am I doing? Like, I don't know how to do this. Okay, you've given me a framework. Okay, let me do this. Let me start implementing. Let me start slow. So I started with only a group of 8 people in my first online group course and was able to troubleshoot. Okay, this is working. This is not working. And because it's such a small group, I could make pivots along the way and really invest the time and not need it to be perfect before I got started with it. And then slowly that has merged. And now, 5 years later, this is a huge biology of trauma course that involves both people in it for themselves, but also a certification course for providers who want to learn more of the biology of trauma, this biology of overwhelm, and how they can implement it in their practice. So what started out as just a very small 8-person online group has now turned into this, several hundred biology of trauma course that I get to help people, but also providers as well learn the material.
It's amazing. So, at first I just want to acknowledge, the journey that you've been on. I think one of the things about what we've seen from people coming through the accelerator is that it's actually some parallels to clinical care, but you build that, you start to build that entrepreneurial muscle, and then you get some wins and you pivot and you learn. And then it's like, well, what else is possible? And, to see that journey where it hasn't really looked like everyone else's journey, and you've created this group program, you started to help other clinicians, it's just a wonderful journey, and it's been exciting to watch along the way. Congratulations on all the progress. One final question, this is the reinvention of medicine. This year is our theme in the evolution of medicine, and particularly we're talking about the reinvention of mental health this summer, and obviously we're talking about addiction. So, what is your, if I had to, ask you, what is your idea of the reinvention of mental health? What does it look like?
This is all the work that I've been doing this year with my whole Biology of Trauma Summit. And for me, what has been really frustrating is seeing how mental health and trauma has been all kind of labeled as something psychological over the years. And what I would love to see as the reinvention of medicine, reinvention of health, is this bridging of the two worlds between actual trauma recovery, trauma work, and functional medicine. Because for me, it is all about the biology and the health consequences, the addictions, everything else is just kind of the downstream effect of what's going on in the biology. It's not our thoughts. It's not, our childhood. It's the fact that our nervous system is still stuck in those patterns from childhood. And that's our biology. And we can shift that. We can change that through these functional medicine principles and actually learning how to work directly with our nervous system, identify and then remove those things that are keeping it stuck in those survival patterns, in that stress and overwhelm. So when I think of reinvention of medicine, and especially with mental health and addictions, how needed this is right now. Looking back over the last year, there have been very, very sad and overwhelming trends in the addiction space in terms of the number of overdoses, the number of people who have relapsed on substances or have developed a new substance or habit or even behaviors in order to cope with the anxiety, cope with the stress, cope with the fear. Social media is a big addiction right now. I mean, it's a huge problem. And so being able to understand, like, look, you guys, this is not just a psychological problem. This is actually a biology problem. And there's so many tools that we have to shift your biology so that we can truly effectively address this and save people years of heartache and years of therapy.
All right, so that was Dr. Aimie Apigian. If you enjoyed that session, you could check out her podcast. It was the last podcast we did last week, and it was really in the theme of this new models. We did talk a little bit about our practice accelerator. This is what we do at the Evolution of Medicine, as well as organizing, practitioner communities. We also provide this program where almost 1,000 doctors have gone through it over the last 5 years. We started in 2016. Aimie was actually in the very first class that went through. And, you can see here on the right, it's about thinking about your niching and positioning, who do you want to try and help, and getting clear on that. It's about really understanding the care and the business model, care delivery and business model. As you heard there, Aimie doesn't see patients one-on-one, only created a group program, and now, does clinician training. There's care delivery technology. So we look into like how to deliver virtual care and what's the best technology stack. We also have the fourth module is on optimizing patient education, creating automated systems that can educate people and that, could take advantage of technology to do that. And then we also talk about the foundations for marketing. The most exciting thing about the accelerator is that, once you have that foundation as a physician entrepreneur, there's so many different directions you can go. You can go to a single clinic, if that's your vision, a series of clinics. We have people in the accelerator who have started functional medicine franchises. And then you could go the direction that Aimie Apigian went, which is just to have online group programs and supporting that, because that's what she felt was the reinvention of medicine for her. So if you go to goevomed.com/accelerator-special, you could check out a free course. You can speak to someone from our team. You can speak to Patrick. He's on the line speaking to people all day, every day. And this is just a great community of practitioners who are moving the needle. And then beyond that, we have curated resources. If you go to goevomed.com/resources, we've curated the best in-kind resources from across the ecosystem to really just try to make it easy for practitioners who are coming into the space to work out, okay, what labs shall I use? What technology should I use? What are the ways that I can do group visits a lot more easily? So check out goevomed.com/resources. Aimie, so I know that was a little bit different. I know you're working all day, every day. You've worked in federally qualified healthcare centers. What are your thoughts about the nervous system and mitochondria and sort of trauma and how it affects biology?
Yeah, I thought everything that she said was so interesting. And I don't have a lot of training in the neurobiology of trauma. So I can't really speak to that, but of course we know that trauma just underlies so much of substance use disorder, and a lot of the pathways intersect. And I'm really interested in her. I do a lot of education and teaching about, the hypothalamic pituitary axis and how cortisol plays into the negative affect associated with withdrawal, and about the vagus nerve and, tipping the parasympathetic sympathetic balance. So a lot of what she said really resonated with me. And I think that the work she's doing is so important and so just such a critical piece for people. And I also think it's just so forward thinking and thoughtful of her to just be online taking care of people. I keep referencing this Scientific American article by Dr. Volkow, and she actually talks about how can we maximize care? Like, how can we get people care where they need it? And she talks about technology. And so I think using a group online format, while we do all love in person and that touch that Dr. Thomas talked about originally, not everybody can do that, especially people in rural places. So using technology to really create outreach, using mobile clinics, this idea of getting out in a Sprinter van or whatever it is, and really truly meeting people where they are to deliver care, whether it's methadone or Suboxone or Vivitrol or auricular acupuncture or hugging people, whatever it is. I think just really thinking outside of the box to figure out how we can reach as many people as we can, because we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it sitting one-on-one in an office like I'm doing all day right now. Yeah. We're going to do it by getting people together in groups. And that's really the next place that I'm going in my life, is figuring out how to bring group medical visits with integrity to my community here in Salt Lake. That's my new job. So
beautiful. Well, I'm excited to work with you on that job because, ultimately we've tried to make it easy for practitioners to, to get into that. The Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center has those great group visit toolkits. I mentioned earlier, Dr. Geller has 5 CMEs available this Friday on the work that he's doing. And I'm, spending a lot of time being involved in Heal Community, which is trying and find a way to like really take a lot of the friction out of the implementation of these kind of things, because what I've seen over time is that a lot of, even though it's kind of obvious that this is the reinvention, I find that a lot of clinicians are quite intimidated by the group environment, right? Where they don't know what's going to happen. And therefore that's scary. And they're scared that like someone's going to do something that they can't control, or that there's going to be something that's going to affect something else. And ultimately what I came to realize, and I've been having very interesting conversations with that, when you see Dr. Geller do his thing, you realize that group facilitation is an amazing skill, but it's not taught in medical school. And ultimately, like, you can build that muscle. Dr. Shilpa Saxena has been on here a number of times, and she's talked about like going to Landmark and like starting to build her skill set to realize that, the humility actually that's necessary to like step in and play that role is critical. So, we're just trying to like, if the plan has to be that every physician in America is going to develop the humility and new skill sets to be able to do it, like, it's never going to work. And so that's why, what I'm really interested in is finding ways that we can create prescribable episodes of care that put people who play that role very well doing that, and we can get the right people in the right seats on the bus. So saying all of that, obviously Aimie has created a different situation for herself, but I know that you're like in the trenches, right? Doing it every day and trying to bring functional medicine, into that. And you said groups. So I guess I just want to ask you this, final question. Is this because the end of our 3-part series on the reinvention of mental health, we'll be talking specifically about addiction. When you think about what you're here to do, which I just heard you say very clearly, where I think, you want to be, what does the reinvention of mental health mean to you? And what are the components that you think have to be there for us to create something that really serves the people that we're looking to serve?
I think, number one is just compassion. We can't medicate this away. We can't criminal justice this away. We can't put people in jail for using substances. We can't sort of institutionalize or create systems like our current healthcare system is not going to treat this. Like, we need to be compassionate. We need to show up for our patients. I think that's number one. And show up for the people in our communities that aren't our patients yet, because they're not going to come be our patients if we're not compassionate healers and providers. So I think compassion is number one. I think number two, the most important thing we can do is educate people. If they don't know, they can't make changes. And I'm telling you, when I was doing my 12-week curriculum in this, residential treatment center, I didn't know if these guys, most of them were guys, some women, I didn't know if they were going to laugh at me or if they were going to embrace me or what they were going to do. But I am telling you, people are hungry for this knowledge. They need it. And it's not just people of low socioeconomic class. I take care of lots of people with lots of money who don't know what fiber is. Okay. So this is all about education. So figuring out how we're going to educate people. And then the third thing is community, just figuring out how to bring people together to provide care. We can't do it the way we're currently doing it. And I agree with you 100% on that. And, somebody said to me once when I was starting I did 2 12-week plant-based curriculums in my private practice with a nutritionist. And I was so scared. Oh, who told me was the woman who helps you on your podcast, the one that I'm blanking on her name now. She helps you with your podcast, and
Daniela?
No, she interviews. She's from
Oh,
St. Louis.
Kristen. Yeah, Kristen.
Yeah, Kristen. When I was first thinking about this and talking to her, she was like, Aimie, just go do it. Like, stop overthinking it. Like, just start doing a functional forum, start doing groups. Because what you'll find is that you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know everything. You just have to show up and be willing to lead a conversation and be inclusive and draw people in, and they will listen and they will learn and they will be grateful. And so that conversation just really inspired me, actually. And so, you know, I loved what Aimie Apigian said, like, you know, stop overthinking it, like, just go do it, you know, because if we don't start doing it, I don't think we're going to move the mark the way that we hope to. Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And I think it's a great place for us to finish there, because, you know, simultaneously with what's happening right now, I've been working with Kristen quite closely, because she has actually built the longest running practitioner community in the country in St. Louis with the St. Louis Institute for Integrative Medicine. And we've been working together to really bring forth the next iteration of functional forum communities. And so I'm super excited that is happening. Like right now, we've got the first 30 communities, the first 30 cities in America that are up and running. It's going to be running this week. So, you know, there's a couple of dates that I want to share with everyone before we run. So on the next functional forum, it's October 4th. It's the pharmacy reinvention. You know, we're really starting to see that pharmacists have such a regular touch with patients in the system that there's a real amazing opportunity for them to revitalize the minds of patients. And then 4 weeks after that, on the 1st of November, we are going back to the live functional forum format. And we're going to have all of those groups around the country connected to watch the live show and be together live. So this is the evolution of medicine, like strategy coming together, when it's really about, you know, making it easy for doctors to build the models of the future and then putting them in rooms together so they can strategize. And so many times I've heard people going into business together, or people feeling more confident to, you know, give other referrals to other practitioners in their community when they've met them at these kind of events. So if we really think that community is the solution to the future of mental health, we have to create it at every level. And that's what we're here to do. Dr. Aimie de la Garza, thank you so much for your participation this evening and your gifts. I know that wherever you end up delivering them, I know they're going to be super valuable, and I'm super excited to help you in bringing community medicine to the Salt Lake City area. I know actually that there's a higher issue of those kind of things in Utah for many reasons, and I know that you know, you've got the right person in the middle of it to make a dent in it in the next decade. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been the Functional Forum. We'll be back on October 4th. But in the meantime, thanks so much for tuning in.